What difference would there be whether the law be written on stone or on our hearts? The experience of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, reveals the answer. Had the king by force been made to live with the cattle, in a stable or in a field, he would have committed suicide if possible. But as soon as God took his human heart away from him and put the heart of an ox in him, the king was perfectly contented to be with the cattle, and altogether discontented to live in his palace. Were the same thing done to any one of us, our desires would be the same as the king's. In like manner, when the stony heart is taken away from us, and the heart of flesh with the law of God written on it put in us, we shall then find it altogether too inconvenient to sin, and most delightful to keep the commandments of God. And so you need not fear having to struggle to keep the law of God in the kingdom, as you do here. You will then be perfectly contented to live a sinless life. In fact, you will want to sin no more than you would now want to die. Wonderful indeed, but when may we expect this miracle to take place? To find the answer to this question, we need connect Jeremiah's prophecy with Ezekiel's prophecy of the same event. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 8. Behold, I will bring them from the north country and gather them from the coasts of the earth, and with them the blind and the lame, the woman with child and her that travaileth with child together. A great company shall return thither. Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 24 to 28. For I will take you from among the heathen, and gather you out of all countries, and will bring you into your own land. Then will I sprinkle clean water upon you, and ye shall be clean. From all your filthiness and from all your idols will I cleanse you. A new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you. I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I will give you an heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk in my statutes, and ye shall keep my judgments, and do them. And ye shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers, and ye shall be my people, and I will be your God. The records from both prophets clearly point out the time in which this miracle will be performed on the hearts of all God's people. Both prophets make it as clear as can be made that this change of heart takes place in the Holy Land, Palestine, at the beginning of the kingdom which God promises to set up in the days of these kings, Daniel chapter 2 verse 44, not after their days. He moreover says that he will take us from among the heathen and gather us from all countries, and take us into our own land, Ezekiel 36:24, the land in which our fathers dwelt, Ezekiel 36:28. Then, at that time, says inspiration, not before, will he sprinkle clean water upon us, cleanse us from all our filthiness and from all our idols. Also, a new heart will he then put in us, Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 26. He will give us his spirit and cause us to comply with his statutes and to keep his judgments, Ezekiel 36:27. Read these scriptures for yourself and see if they say all I am trying to tell you they say. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 35 through 40. Thus saith the Lord, which giveth the sun for a light by day, and the ordinances of the moon and of the stars for a light by night, which divideth the sea when the waves thereof roar. The Lord of hosts is his name. If those ordinances depart from before me, saith the Lord, then the seed of Israel also shall cease from being a nation before me forever. Thus saith the Lord, if heaven above can be measured, and the foundations of the earth searched out beneath, I will also cast off all the seed of Israel for all they have done, saith the Lord. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that the city shall be built to the Lord from the tower of Hananeel unto the gate of the corner. And the measuring line shall yet go forth against it upon the hill Gareb, and shall pass about Goath, and the whole valley of the dead bodies, and of the ashes, and of all the fields, unto the brook of Kidron, unto the corner of the horse gate toward the east, shall be holy unto the Lord. It shall not be plucked up nor thrown down any more forever. People can believe anything they wish to believe, but we shall believe the Bible. I know that this is what the Bible teaches, and that this is God's schedule for these events." End quote. Selected. Here is the dilemma for Adventists. For decades, the early Adventists were given to believe that the saints would, under no circumstances, go to, quote, "Old Jerusalem," end quote. There are many Bible prophecies that foretell of God's returning a faithful remnant of His people to the land of promise, Israel. There are also true testimonies regarding how we should not go to Israel to try to convert the Jews there, for we would have little positive results. Quote, "Then I was pointed to some who are in the great error of believing that it is their duty to go to Old Jerusalem, and think that they have a work to do there before the Lord comes. Such a view is calculated to take the mind and interest from the present work of the Lord, under the message of the third angel. For those who think that they are yet to go to Jerusalem will have their minds there, and their means will be withheld from the cause of present truth to get themselves and others there. I saw that such a mission would accomplish no real good, that it would take a long while to make a very few of the Jews believe even in the first advent of Christ, much more to believe in His second advent. I saw that Satan had greatly deceived some in this thing, and that souls all around them in this land could be helped by them and led to keep the commandments of God, but they were leaving them to perish. I also saw that Old Jerusalem never would be built up, and that Satan was doing his utmost to lead the minds of the children of the Lord into these things now, in the gathering time, to keep them from throwing their whole interest into the present work of the Lord, and to cause them to neglect the necessary preparation for the day of the Lord." End quote. Early Writings, page 75 and 76. The context of this statement reveals that it refers to the Jewish Zionist movement, and it shows that the movement's avowed purpose to reestablish a national Jewish homeland centered in Jerusalem proper will never be realized, that never will Old Jerusalem be rebuilt in accordance with the Zionist interpretation, and never will the non-Christian Jews be the subjects of the kingdom. Furthermore, her saying that no one is to go to Old Jerusalem to teach the Jews of the second coming of Christ because they would not believe, simply means what it says. Quote, "It is not our present work, her time," end quote. But when the gospel is presented in its fullness to the Jews, many will believe. See Acts of the Apostles, page 380 through 382. In regard to the present activities in Old Jerusalem and of the returning of Jews to their homeland as fulfilling the promises made to the descendants of Jacob, we must not lose sight of the fact that the promises are not to find their fulfillment in the returning to the promised land of either Jews who denied and crucified their Lord, or their descendants who in nearly 2,000 years have failed to accept Him as their Savior, but rather in God's bringing there those Jews who are Jews not only by blood, but also by faith. The promise, therefore, is unmistakably to the latter, and to their descendants who composed the Christian church in its beginning, and who were willing to die for rather than to deny their Lord. The promise is not, in other words, to the unconverted, represented first by Ishmael and second by Esau. Rather, it is their younger brethren, the converted Jews, represented first by Isaac and second by Jacob. It is therefore to those who have allowed the Lord to change their names from Jews, fleshly Israel, to Christians, spiritual Israel, just as Jacob, their forefather, allowed God to change his name from Jacob to Israel. Thus, being by natural birth the seed of Jacob, and by spiritual birth the seed of Christ, the truth, they are both sons of Jacob and sons of God, and hence full-fledged Jews, Israelites indeed. The reasons for this belief lie in certain statements by Ellen White, as follows. Quote, "God has shown me about some trying to get a substitute after the time past. Some would get Jesus upon the great white cloud. Others would be looking to Old Jerusalem, or as they call it, the age to come." End quote. Letter 8, 1851, page 4. To dear brother and sister Howland, November 12, 1851. Manuscript Release, Volume 4, page 404. There we find that in the early days of the movement, there were those who embraced a doctrine that was called, quote, the age to come, end quote, and that said teaching had to do with a return to Old Jerusalem. It was at that time that more light was given the remnant concerning the specific error and how it related to the present work under the third angel, which we have seen previously is not of itself to be the last message. Bear in mind that Ellen White had no specific light on what was to transpire during the number of days from the time of the saints' first deliverance at the voice of God until Christ's actual return in the clouds of heaven, except that they would, during that time, the time of the Jubilee, rise from glory to glory. Moreover, time has shown that there is more to the outworking of that which was underlying the return to Jerusalem movement in her days than many expected. That is, the Zionist movement was but in its infancy during Ellen White's lifetime, and but few expected it to result in the many, many Jews returning to Israel as we have witnessed after World War II. While it is true that Old Jerusalem has not been built up, the Muslim Arab presence there preventing such from fully occurring, great effort and expenditure has been successfully made by Jews and Christians alike to build up a large city there. But while the Zionist movement was never considered to be a religious movement, many of its prominent leaders being Jewish in heredity only, many Christians today are portraying that secular movement as the fulfillment of the spiritual restoration the Bible speaks of. That is, rather than seeking God's interpretations of the Bible prophecies, they are creating their own interpretations based on their own private interpretations. What is significant about this is that God was fully aware that there would be Christians and others who would give weight to the counterfeit movement that the devil was going to try and pass off as the fulfillment of the prophecies concerning the promised land in the last days, and has allowed it in order to try the hearts of men. Thus, even the Adventists were only to be given limited light on these aspects of the last days. That is, many Adventists in Ellen White's day would have mocked the idea that there would be the large city which we see today in the land of Israel known as Jerusalem, and in its same place, simply because Ellen White saw that, quote, Old Jerusalem would never be built up, end quote. Moreover, there is nothing specific in Ellen White's writings about the current situation in Jerusalem and the Middle East. Yet, all that is currently transpiring there was not only foreknown to God, but is written in prophecy. But as the vast majority of the leadership in the Adventist Church are not looking for any new light on the matter, but are instead saying by their actions and attitude that they are, quote, rich and increased with goods and in need of nothing, end quote, the light that they do have is going out. To understand how all of this relates to the saints going to the goodly land after the first deliverance for the final cleansing in preparation for Christ's visible coming, we must look at more of what Ellen White has to say about Old Jerusalem. Quote, how many there are who feel that it would be a good thing to tread the soil of Old Jerusalem, and that their faith would be greatly strengthened by visiting the scenes of the Savior's life and death. But Old Jerusalem will never be a sacred place until it is cleansed by the refining fire from heaven. The darkest blot of guilt rests upon the city that refused the light of Christ. Do we want to walk in the footsteps of Jesus? We need not seek out the paths in Nazareth, Bethany, and Jerusalem. We shall find the footprints of Jesus by the sickbed, by the side of suffering humanity, in the hovels of the poverty-stricken and distressed. We may walk in these footsteps, comforting the suffering, speaking words of hope and comfort to the despondent. Doing as Jesus did when he was upon earth, we shall walk in his blessed steps. Jesus said, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. When the sin-cursed earth is purified from every stain of sin, when the Mount of Olives is rent asunder and becomes an immense plain, when the holy city of God descends upon it, the land that is now called the Holy Land will indeed become holy. But God's cause and work will not be advanced by making pilgrimages to Jerusalem. The curse of God is upon Jerusalem for the rejection and crucifixion of his only begotten Son. But God will cleanse away the vile blot. The prophet says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth are passed away, and the sea is no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. End quote. Review and Herald, June 9, 1896. Therein she reveals the time when, quote, the land that is now called the Holy Land will indeed become holy, end quote. That being, quote, when the Mount of Olives is rent asunder and becomes an immense plain, end quote. When reading any of Ellen White's writings, we must keep in mind what she said about why she was called to write the things she did, and that is, quote, I commend to you, dear reader, the Word of God as the rule of your faith and practice. By that Word we are to be judged. God has, in that Word, promised to give visions in the last days, not for a new rule of faith, but for the comfort of his people, and to correct those who err from Bible truth. Thus God dealt with Peter when he was about to send him to preach to the Gentiles. Acts 10. End quote. Early Writings, page 78. And, quote, little heed is given to the Bible, and the Lord has given a lesser light to lead men and women to the greater light. End quote. Review and Herald, January 20, 1903. From those statements we learn that whatever light she was given was, quote, not for a new rule of faith, end quote, but is to be, quote, a lesser light to lead men and women to the greater light, end quote, the Bible. That is, her writings have not been given to us to supersede the Bible, but only, quote, comfort of his people and to correct those who err from Bible truth, end quote. With this in mind, we must look to the Bible for the greater light on the matter of the rending of the Mount of Olives, of which she speaks in the foregoing testimony. But in doing so, what we must also take into consideration is why Ellen White was given light in this regards. The question comes down to what understanding on this matter was held by those in the movement at that time. We will explore this matter further on in this study. The rending of the Mount of Olives she is referring to is that which is written in Zechariah 14. Quote, and his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west. And there shall be a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south. End quote. Zechariah chapter 14, verse 4. A candid reading of that verse, in the context of the surrounding verses, shows that it most definitely could have a premillennial application, and not at all a postmillennial one, as Ellen White and her brethren were given to believe. That is, verses 1 through 3 read, quote, behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished. And half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. End quote. Zechariah chapter 14, verses 1 to 3. The verse following verse 4, wherein it is said that the Lord's feet cleaves the Mount of Olives, reads, quote, and ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azel. Yea, ye shall flee, like as ye fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and the Lord my God shall come, and all the saints with thee. End quote. The, quote, ye, end quote, and the, quote, thee, end quote, therein refer to those who are to flee to the valley of the mountains, in order to receive deliverance and protection in that valley. Note that verse 4 begins with the word and, inseparably connecting it with the preceding verse 3, which states that that time is when, quote, the Lord goes forth and fights against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle, end quote. Furthermore, verse 3 begins with the word, quote, then, end quote, which ties it inseparably to the time of the fulfillment of verses 1 and 2, which are a time when God gathers, quote, all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and that half the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city, end quote. But we must also bear in mind that the vast majority of Christians in her day believed that the prophecies such as this, which appear to have a literal application to the nation of Israel, were considered to have been conditional, meaning that since ancient Israel failed to meet the conditions God was then requiring, then all of the prophecies that were to be fulfilled for, through, and in them have been rendered null and void. The Seventh-day Adventist Bible Commentary says the following concerning the prophecies in Zechariah chapter 14. Quote, Chapter 14 is a description of events in connection with the second coming of the Messiah in terms of how this spectacular event would have come about if the Israelites who returned from captivity had fulfilled their destiny, inasmuch as they turned again and again from their high privileges and ultimately rejected the Messiah, Acts chapter 3 and chapter 13 verses 13 to 15, God turned from them. He is now accomplishing his purposes through the Christian church. Care must be exercised when applying the prophecies of Zechariah 14 to our day. The principles outlined on page 25 through 38 must be carefully observed in the interpretation of Zechariah 14, or else unwarranted conclusions may be drawn. End quote. Seventh-day Adventist Bible Commentary, page 1116. Emphasis added. With all due respect to those who wrote the commentary, the reason why Adventists have gotten into trouble in the past regarding their stand on certain prophecies and doctrines is because they have leaned upon the, quote, arm of flesh, end quote, rather than the arm of God. But such a situation is not limited to them. Even John the Baptist had some private opinions on the prophecies which relate to Christ's first coming. The resolution of controversy today over who is to receive the covenant promises concerning the restoration to the promised land is found in the answer to the question, who is Israel? It is written, quote, they are not all Israel which are of Israel, end quote. Romans chapter 9 verse 6. The Apostle Paul goes on to say that it has always been only those of faith who were considered to be the seed of Abraham and of the true vine, whether or not they were of the sons of Jacob, Israel. He also speaks of how, quote, blindness in part is happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in, end quote. Romans chapter 11 verse 25. That part was the unbelieving Jews, who were, as a part of the whole nation of Israel, according to Paul's analogy, broken off of the good olive tree, and others, the Gentiles, nations, quote, were grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree, end quote. The them, the unbroken branches, among whom others were grafted in, were the believing Jews, and afterwards those of the lost sheep of the house of Israel, upon whom the gospel first lightened, Isaiah chapter 9 verse 8, and then the multitude of Gentiles. Though the unbelieving Jewish leaders wanted to deny their believing brethren a right to the land promised to their fathers, there is nothing in the Scriptures which states that said promise has been revoked from the believing Jews as it has been from the unbelieving ones. It is quite to the contrary, as we read, quote, and I heard the number of them which were sealed, and there were sealed 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel, end quote. Revelation chapter 7 verse 4. those 144,000 Israelites have the privilege to stand on the Mount Zion with the Lamb, as the covenant promises made to Abraham concerning the land was to be fulfilled to his literal seed and to those who would become a part of them. It is quite reasonable for us to expect to see the return of the land to the believing Israelites and those with them during the predicted Jubilee. Therefore, the question is not unto whom will the promise of the inheritance of the land be fulfilled, for that is clearly to be fulfilled to Israel's literal seed, quote, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile, end quote, but rather it comes down to when will this aspect of the Jubilee meet its fulfillment. The key to that mystery is found in understanding the timing of the cleaving of the Mount of Olives. With all the foregoing in mind, we will now look at why Ellen White and the Adventists in general believe that the cleaving of the Mount of Olives is to only take place after the millennium. This belief comes from Ellen White's second vision, which she titled Vision of the New Earth. As the early Adventist movement was made up of people from many different denominations, there were many diverse opinions on Bible doctrines, especially on the interpretations of the Bible prophecies. While God was able to bring most of those who were a part of the early movement to understand that the 2300 days were to terminate on October 22, 1844, God did not correct the commonly held, private, uninspired opinion that the earth was the sanctuary, which was to be cleansed by fire at the end of that time period. But as Adventists now understand, that strange circumstance was designed to be for a future test upon the people to see who was really willing to follow the Lord alone into all truth, and who were satisfied in leaning upon the arm of flesh, private opinions and interpretations. Ellen G. Harmon, White, was given two visions about a year apart, in December 1844 and December 1845, which were understood to be a delineation of events in the Advent movement. The first vision, titled My First Vision, commences with the midnight cry of 1844 and does not include the whole movement, beginning with the first and second angels' messages of 1840 through 1844. These two visions were first published in the form in which they were presented to a brother for his personal comfort in his trying time, and were not intended for general circulation. In that presentation, which later appeared in the Day Star Extra and A Word to the Little Flock, the two visions were connected together to portray one long series of events. They also appear this way in early writings, though there are a few differences in the wording. They also appear in Life Sketches, Spiritual Gifts Volume 2, and Testimonies Volume 1 as two separate visions. This second vision appears, by a superficial reading, to be a revelation of things and events which will transpire after the millennium, and has been previously understood to be just that. But a closer examination of the contents of the vision, in the light of already revealed truths in the Bible, will show that many of the events portrayed in this second vision cannot be literal neither before nor after the millennium, and must therefore be symbolical. Furthermore, we will see that every representation in the vision represents the fulfillment of different Bible prophecies which were intended to be understood by the church in the last days. Here is that second vision. Quote, With Jesus at our head, we all descended from the city down to this earth, on a great and mighty mountain which could not bear Jesus up, and it parted asunder, and there was a mighty plain. Then we looked up and saw the great city, with 12 foundations and 12 gates, 3 on each side, and an angel at each gate. We all cried out, The city, the great city, it's coming down from God out of heaven. And it came and settled on the place where we stood. Then we began to look at the glorious things outside of the city. There I saw most glorious houses. They had the appearance of silver, supported by 4 pillars set with pearls, most glorious to behold, which were to be inhabited by the saints, and in them was a golden shelf. I saw many of the saints go into the houses, take off their glittering crowns, and lay them on the shelf, then go out into the field by the houses to do something with the earth. not as we have to do with the earth here, no, no. A glorious light shone all about their heads, and they were continually shouting and offering praises to God. And I saw another field full of all kinds of flowers, and as I plucked them I cried out, "They will never fade." Next I saw a field of tall grass, most glorious to behold. It was living green and had a reflection of silver and gold, as it waved proudly to the glory of King Jesus. Then we entered a field full of all kinds of beasts, the lion, the lamb, the leopard, and the wolf, all together in perfect union. We passed through the midst of them, and they followed on peaceably after. Then we entered a wood, not like the dark woods we have here, no, no, but light and all over glorious. The branches of the trees waved to and fro, and we all cried out, "We will dwell safely in the wilderness and sleep in the woods." We passed through the woods, for we were on our way to Mount Zion. As we were traveling along, we met a company who were also gazing at the glories of the place. I noticed red as a border on their garments. Their crowns were brilliant. Their robes were pure white. As we greeted them, I asked Jesus who they were. He said they were martyrs that had been slain for him. With them was an innumerable company of little ones. They had a hem of red on their garments also. Mount Zion was just before us, and on the mount sat a glorious temple, and about it were 7 other mountains, on which grew roses and lilies. And I saw the little ones climb, or, if they chose, use their little wings and fly to the top of the mountains and pluck the never-fading flowers. There were all kinds of trees around the temple to beautify the place. The box, the pine, the fir, the oil, the myrtle, the pomegranate, and the fig tree bowed down with the weight of its timely figs. That made the place look all over glorious. And as we were about to enter the holy temple, Jesus raised his lovely voice and said, "Only the 144,000 enter this place." And we shouted, "Hallelujah!" Well, bless the Lord, dear brethren and sisters. This is an extra meeting for those who have the seal of the living God. This temple was supported by 7 pillars, all of transparent gold, set with pearls most glorious. The glorious things I saw there I cannot describe to you. Oh, that I could talk in the language of Canaan, then could I tell a little of the glory of the upper world. But if faithful, you soon will all know about it. I saw there tables of stone in which the names of the 144,000 were engraved in letters of gold. After we had beheld the glory of the temple, we went out, and Jesus left us and went to the city. Soon we heard his lovely voice again, saying, "Come, my people, you have come out of great tribulation, and have done my will, suffered for me. Come in to the supper, for I will gird myself and serve you." We shouted, "Hallelujah! Glory!" and entered into the city. And I saw a table of pure silver. It was many miles in length, yet our eyes could extend over it. I saw the fruit of the tree of life, the manna, almonds, figs, pomegranates, grapes, and many other kinds of fruit. I asked Jesus to let me eat of the fruit. He said, "Not now. Those who eat the fruit of this land go back to earth no more. But in a little while, if faithful, ye shall both eat of the fruit of the tree of life and drink of the water of the fountain." And he said, "You must go back to earth again and relate to others what I have revealed to you." Then an angel bore me gently down to this dark world. Sometimes I think I can stay here no longer. All things of earth look so dreary. I feel very lonely here, for I have seen a better land. Oh, that I had wings like a dove, then would I fly away and be at rest." End quote. A Word to the Little Flock, pages 16 to 18.